He actually hid drugs in my office. He then called the police. Grief is not just to do with the loss of somebody. The greatest thing in the world is love, and it's love we should strive for. And if we strive for those things, why do we need all the religiosity and all this loading on and all the rest? I took the wedding ceremony for my granddaughter, who is gay, to her beautiful partner. They love each other. So who are we to judge them? People say, what are you doing on your birthday? And I say, I'm going to the cemetery.
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today I'm speaking with the Reverend James Colville. Most people now call him Jim. That's correct, isn't it now, Jim?
It certainly is, yes.
But you first opened the doors of Colony 47 in 1973 in Hobart, and it was a very different place back then. There was no gay rights, access to contraception was difficult, and people were rejected for being different. And after renting an old church at 47 Davy Street, Hobart, a coffee shop was open where everyone was welcomed and help was provided when requested. This included many young people, older people, Indigenous Australians, the lonely, hungry and unemployed. Jim believed those struggling with rejection had a lot to give with the right support. They just needed non-judgemental assistance, acceptance and respect. 50 years on, Colony 47 has now evolved into Homebase, a not-for-profit organisation that continues to deliver programs for Tasmanians in need with a particular focus on housing. It has helped more than 50,000 households with bond or rent assistance, more than 7,000 young people with early intervention support, and more than 17,500 young people with education and employment. I am so excited to have a chat with you today, Jim. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Jim, I had the opportunity to hear you speak earlier this year at an Ageing Australia conference. And what I couldn't believe at that time was how you had such a different approach in a period where it was very, risque for you to be doing what you were doing. So can you tell me a little bit about that time and what motivated you to, found Colony 47?
Well, thank you. Well, I started it in 1973 and I'm 87 now, so I'm not sure why I got invited to speak at an ageing conference, but never mind. It was an amazing year, 73. It was the year that the vote was changed from 21 to 18 for young people. Inflation was over 9%. That wouldn't go down too well today. It was the end of the Vietnam War through the Paris Peace Accords and the White Australia policy, where people who weren't white weren't allowed into Australia. That ended that year too. So as well as that, that was the year I started. So it was a very strange place. I originally came from Melbourne. The church told me I could be appointed from a working class area to a very nice area in Victoria, looking out over the water. But actually what they were talking about was East Devonport in Tasmania. So I finished up there. I was still looking over the same water, but from the other side. And I found the church rather conservative in some areas. There were some good people there, but they rejected anyone that was a bit different. A lot of girls that got pregnant out of wedlock, they weren't accepted by their family and they were rejected. And often they had to leave and pretend they'd gone to Victoria for a year to have work, but they were actually having a child, and then they had to adopt the child out and come back without the child. And that was just one area because contraceptives were almost impossible to get. And the reason for that is that a lot of religious people felt that to have contraceptives would lead to a total collapse of the standards and morality of our society. But that meant some girls were getting pregnant and finishing up having backyard abortions, and some died from it. So I wanted to have a place where people were accepted. And if they were a gay background or LGBTQIA, I wanted them to feel that they could be welcomed in to a new place. And to do that, I had to, with the use of young people, raise over $3,000 for 1 year's rent and to rent a church where we could open the doors to anyone.
And tell me a little bit about those first 10 years, Jim. Yeah, I'd say that there would have been quite a few challenges.
Yes. The first thing was because I wasn't a minister as doing a minister's role that was accepted by the church. I had to move when I moved to Colony. There was no income, so I had no stipend, and I lost the parsonage or the manse where we lived. So a friend said, "This, if it works, it's going to be wonderful, and if it doesn't work, it'll show you how stupid you are." But it did work, and I had to rent a church, and that in itself was a long deal because I couldn't offer as much money as others. But we finally did get it. I was Methodist. This was a congregational church that had closed. And we were able to open it, and then the young people helped me restore it. It was in bad condition. And then we opened the doors, and then I made the big mistake of painting the front door red, something new and bright and starting. And I got attacked by the National Trust and by a lot of politicians who thought I was a convict, sorry, a communist. And
Oh, of course, in that time as well, it would have been quite
yeah,
the communist colour to be painting the front door.
well, worse than that, that year I'd been invited to go to Russia, to Moscow, to a peace congress. I went there because it was to try and follow up peace. But of course, that didn't help very much. And I finished up being for a few days, I was appointed the leader when the leader of the Australian contingent was ill. So I finished up in the Kremlin, and it was, yes, that didn't help with the feud. And they started to, it made it very difficult to get any funding for Colony at that stage. Well, that's a rather difficult because all you can do is do what you feel you should do. And I was working with a whole range of young people and older people too. One area I was working with were Catholic women who were married. They married somebody that bashed them up after a month, and the church told them that they had to remain married for the rest of their life. And in some cases, they were being terribly, well, it's happening still today, isn't it, within the community. And I worked with them. I spoke with them, and we tried to help them re-establish and find somewhere else to live and protect them. It was also the same case with others that were being very badly treated. And so you slowly build up, I think, through the number of people that you're working with and helping, that starts to give you some credibility, because counselling, helping a young person who is struggling and close to wanting to commit suicide, and you say to them, no, don't. And you start to convince them that they are worthy of living. And I always believed in it's not what is, but what can be. And I think that came from my own experience. All my life, I was treated and bullied at school, treated by the teachers that I'd be absolutely useless and hopeless. And that went on. And I think when that comes to you and you've been treated so badly yourself, you either become one yourself and bully others, or in my case, as some others have done, you say, I don't want this to happen to other people who are being judged, criticised, and told that they're useless and worthless. And that's why I think you slowly build up over a number of years credibility, because you just work with people and they see that you really care for them.
And Jim, who was the person that supported you when you had obviously gone through that experience at school, and you've spoken very openly about how you were bullied during that period? And where did you find support, and where to raise you up to the point where you were then in a position to be helping others?
Well, I was treated really badly, but then I linked up with a church where they had a cricket team. And as the surprising thing, there was a minister there who had only done about 6 year training at education. He was the most beautiful, wonderful person you can meet anywhere. And he showed that he thought that there was potential in me. And if he had have come along a little later, they wouldn't have even accepted him to be in the ministry because he didn't have a matric or matriculation or anything else. So there was somebody that had been judged in some ways, but was such a beautiful person and so Christ-like. In fact, often they didn't even have food themselves because he'd given the food away to families that he felt needed food more. So I went into what was a home mission training college. When you got there, you were either white sheep or black sheep. I was black, of course, black sheep straight away because I wasn't doing what I should do. And in the end, that worked very well because when we got appointed, the good people got appointed out into the background and the country far out. But when it came to me, I got the best appointment in the middle of Melbourne because they said they couldn't trust me enough to send me out and without strong supervision. So what happened was that's where I met my wife. We were married for over 50 years. My wife was a chiropodist and podiatrist. And when first time I preached in the church, I asked somebody who she was, and they told me. So the next sermon I preached was how beautiful are the feet of those that preach the gospel. And somebody having size 12 feet, even a podiatrist would like. And out of the silence of the church, my wife-to-be made the comment, he's got to be joking. And I thought at that point that was the end of it. But as it was, we finished up, we were married and we had 50 beautiful years together before she died of lung cancer. And again, when she died of lung cancer, a lot of people said it's her own fault because she smoked all the time. My wife never smoked in her life. And that often happens when people are always so judgmental or finding something to judge. She never smoked in her life, but because there was a lot of passive smoking in those days.
And why do you think it is? Because you would have, being an outcast yourself and a black sheep as you describe yourself, why do you think it is that you've seen in all of the different things that you've experienced? Why is it that you think people are so easy and quick to judge others?
I don't know what it is. Sometimes I found that often that I've got a daughter who's a person with Down syndrome, and she was likewise judged because of who she is. And she's a beautiful person, and we were given that she would only live 17 years, but she's now 56, and health is starting to decline. But again, I was going to write a book called No Party for Julianne because she was never invited to parties. My other daughters were, but she never was. When she finally was, she was so beautiful and enjoyed it all. So again, it's people who are different. And what we found also in the schools when they closed a lot of the special schools and moved them into mainstream schools, that some of the bullies in the classes suddenly had somebody down further than themselves that they could attack and make it even harder for them. So often what one has to do is find out why they themselves are like that. You often find some of them are being bullied and hurt and treated extremely bad all their life. So what you've got to do is to find what's good in them and start to change it. And that sometimes I've seen some kids that were in and out of jail and things like that. Finally, with a bit of acceptance and love, not all of them, of course, but some of them started to change and were very helpful at Colony because they could speak the language of some of the other young ones that were there. On the other hand, when I disciplined one several times, he actually hid drugs in my office. He then called the police. I was a justice of the peace for 39 years, but luckily some other young people told me and we found the drugs and got rid of them. And 30 minutes later, the police turned up, looked for them. Now, I would never have been a justice of the peace if I got caught like that. So you had that problem as well, where some of them were out to get you, and it's the old one again that sometimes mud sticks when it shouldn't have even been thrown.
And what happened in that scenario? Did you chat to the lad that had actually popped those surprises in your office?
The other young people protected me by watching what he had done. He was very upset that good drugs had been thrown in the fire. But, bringing rules up to control, it doesn't always work. Like, for example, we said you could only buy one can of Coca-Cola or whatever, because if they bought two, they'd drink one and throw one in the fire and it'd explode and and nearly burn the place down. So here we are saying, only buy one can, doesn't work. they just got somebody else to buy too. So you've just got to say, go along with it. And he actually later on, he left and I didn't see much more about him, but they did a drawing and put it up on the wall of myself with the founder of Colony 47, "Don't let this happen to you." And everyone used to throw darts at it. So it keeps you humble. You never get, and some days life was so bad. When I went in, I threw a few too. But when you walk in, there's a photo of yourself on the wall with a dart between the eyes. It does bring you down to earth and it humbles you. Yeah. So there was a lot of fun and joy too, and a lot of celebration when young people achieve things that they never thought they could achieve. So you've got to achieve that too. On the other hand, quite a lot of young people died in car accidents or because of drugs. And that was another sad part where often young people who had never thought about death were suddenly confronted with a friend who was killed in a car accident. And I got to take a lot of funerals and it was very sad.
And can you talk us through what is perhaps unique about that type of traumatic death that happens when someone is younger? It is unexpected. What techniques did you use within that community to support them during that time, Jim?
Oh, well, most people think because I'm a minister, I'm going to give them a sermon and it's going to be all that, but I don't. I think there's always a danger when people say, "Oh, well, I've lost somebody too, and I know exactly how you feel." You don't always exactly know how the other person feels, so you've got to be very careful of that. Sometimes silence is helpful rather than people going in and talking. Sometimes people, they want to say things and they try to say things all the time and it doesn't help. Sometimes just silence is enough that they know you care and you spend time with a person. And sometimes it's also to do with whether it's been something that was expected, somebody that was going to take time to die, and the family and the children knew that they were dying. On other times, it happens instantly. For 20 years now, on my birthday, people say, "What are you doing on your birthday?" And I say, "I'm going to the cemetery." And they can't understand that. But there was a family, they weren't religious, but on my birthday, their daughter was murdered by a boyfriend. And I took the funeral service. And each year they invite me back on my birthday, on the day that she was murdered, to conduct just 4 or 5 minutes, nothing religious because none of them are religious, but just something to do about life and death and the rest of it. Next to her, the other sister lost their daughter. The one who was murdered was 24. The one next to her was 22. She was killed in a car accident. They were sitting parked and a car got out of control and hit them and she got killed. So these two together. And since then, the mother of the daughter that was killed in the car accident has now died and she's buried with her daughter. So when I go there, I share that with them. And I've bought a location nearby. So when I die, that's where I'll finish up too. They're a beautiful family and they still hurt. And nothing worse than the people that you get that come along and say, "Get over it. It was a year ago, it was 6 months ago or 3 months." You'd never really get over it when you've lost people like that. So to share moments like that, and they then give me a card that's always a funny one, something absolutely ridiculous. And they give me a present. And when I turned 80, when I got there, they had this beautiful cake. Because I breed alpacas, it was an alpaca cake. I said, "I hope it hasn't spat on it." So, but that happens every year, and these are beautiful people. So I do spend a lot of time with people who have lost loved ones. And then, of course, my own wife, everyone expected because I'm overweight that I'd die first, and I was older than my wife. She died at 71, 5 days past her birthday. And I spent 2 years looking after her as she struggled with lung cancer, as I said before. And, I've never shared this other than with 3 or 4 people. I don't know whether I should now, but she was in what's called the Whittle ward, which is where people go to die. And she didn't want to stay in there. She wanted to come home. So she did come home and we were told I wouldn't be able to look after her. And the first week was immense. But then under district nurses, we got help and she was able to die in her own home. And she lived 50 more days after she came out of the Whittle ward. She hung on because that got us to our 50th wedding anniversary. And it was beautiful because we had an open day and she sat at the front door to welcome all the people who came. And when they came in, they said, where's Jim? And my wife said, oh, he doesn't even turn up to our 50th wedding anniversary. I'd got appendicitis on the Friday, and one of my daughters was a paramedic, took me to hospital, and I finished up in hospital. And they all burst into laughter. They didn't believe it. And it was so beautiful that instead of concentrating on my wife, they could concentrate. They'd say, he doesn't even turn up to his own 50th. Well, I sneaked out of the hospital, got home and spent a few hours there. And my wife said, oh, I'm glad you finally turned up. And she died a week or so later. And then I was put into the situation, for the last time in your life, what do you give somebody that you've spent maybe 50 years of marriage and known for 55 years? What do you give them when they've got about 5 days to live and it's their birthday? What present can you give them? Chocolates don't mean a thing. Flowers, plenty of those there. What can I do? And I've only shared this with a few people, but I will today. I did come up with a present for her at that time. Have you got any idea what you would give somebody you loved who's got only 5 days to live? It's hard, isn't it?
It's really hard. It would probably be something that he's always wanted, that we always fought over, that I'd finally relinquished to be his. We have something like a McLaren collection or something like that. So something that was personal to him and I think it would be.
Yeah. No, well, I didn't do that. At the age of 76, my wife used to be in her bed looking out the window at the bluebirds, the wrens and all the rest playing around. And it meant so much to her, and so much better being at home because people could visit, you see.
Yeah.
So she was looking at these birds. So that was very important to her. So at the age of 76, a beautiful lady, a highly skilled lady, gave me a tattoo of my wife's name with a beautiful bluebird. She spent 4 hours doing it, and the bird is flying off and dropping a ribbon, a white ribbon, which represented lung cancer, freeing Margaret from her illness and her pain and her sickness, dropping the ribbon away. And I showed my wife and she loved it. And I said, I've only got a week. If you don't like it, for me to take it back. And and she laughed. And the lady who had done it came out and visited Margaret, and Margaret gave her flowers and thanked her for the gift. And then I spoiled it all by saying, Margaret, I've really ruined this. It looks like after you die, I'll have to marry a Margaret. No one else will want me. And she tried to slap me with a big smile on her face. So that's what I did, and I don't regret it. It was a lovely gift to my wife, and it reminds me of her every day.
And where did you get it? Where did you get the tattoo, Jim?
On my leg. Mm.
Oh, how lovely.
Yeah. Nobody in the church knows up to now, but yes, I'll show you a photo later if you want to.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, the lady did a beautiful job, and at 76, the minister getting a tattoo, but my wife loved it, and it was my gift to her, and it was the last thing I could do, and 5 days later she died. So that also helped me to appreciate people that are going through the grief. And to me, grief is not just to do with the loss of somebody. Because we were so broke, it took us years to build a house. And that meant a lot to us because it was such a long and hard job with no money. And we finally built the house and it finished up in a landslip. And everyone said, you're a minister. How come you built on a landslip? Because no one's getting paid because it's called an act of God by the insurance company. And everyone said, how come you didn't know? You're a minister, and why didn't God tell you? I said, she never mentioned it to me. And they said, I said, yes, prostates and landslips come under a female god. Well, they didn't know how to answer that one. And then we lost our house there and got very little money for it. And then we moved to Baghdad, and it was the worst house in Tasmania. It had been vacant for 40 years and was falling down. And that took us 10 years to restore it again, but it's a National Trust building, and that's where we are now. So that was a loss too. And Margaret's mother her house when she had a stroke and was living with us and came over from Melbourne. While she was with us, somebody broke in and not only stole all the stuff that she had, and she'd spent her lifetime doing absolutely superb crocheting and things like that. They then burnt the house down and that was all lost. So for my wife, we never told her mother. She was close to dying herself, and we never told her because she was always going to go home. We didn't want her to feel that. And so you see, when people say grief, it's not always to do with the loss of a loved one. It can be other things, items, and something that's important. So that to me helps you to be sensitive to how people feel. And I think when I take funerals, some people have said they're not very religious, but I try to do it the way it's meaningful to the person, to the family. And often when they've lost a loved one, they don't want a long sermon or talking about saving them from hellfire and brimstone and all that rubbish. I don't believe that. I just try to be a friend to them and to be there when they want me and have a service that's meaningful to them, that they can understand and say, yes, that helped us. So that's all I can do. Not perfect, make lots of mistakes, but you try.
Where has your good sense of humour come from, Jim?
Oh, geez. Some people had my family would be very upset. They said, I've got a terrible sense of humour. In fact, in the church service I only take for a year so I can stir the lovely people at Claremont. I have a period which is to do with modern, what's happening in the world today. It seems silly to be talking about Israel and that 4,000 years ago with what's going on at the moment. But I also have a time of humour, and I tell a joke that's religious, but it's also funny, and people laugh at them. They really enjoy the jokes and that. The old ones, things like the lady who, when the minister visits her, gives him a big bowl of peanuts, and he eats, and he apologised afterwards and said, I've eaten too many. And she said, don't worry about it. She said, I hate peanuts. That's why I only suck all the chocolate off them before I put them in the plate. And, things like that. and worse ones. And I'm a chaplain I never went to Vietnam myself. I was very much against the involvement, but I'm chaplain to the returned soldiers. Many of them die younger too because of what they went through. And I'm also chaplain to the group that have been injured and in war and all the rest. So I've got those two areas I work with. But almost every fortnight, they send me jokes they say, now, Jim, use this joke in church on Sunday. Well, if I used any of them, I'd be out instantly because they pick some terribly dirty jokes and they say, go on, Jim, use this one. Well, I love that because it means they're treating me with respect, I think. I'm not the clergy, I'm their friend, and they just go along with the joke. So,
And that seems to be something that's very, very clear in your storytelling. Like when I think of when you were talking about the fact that they'd drawn a picture of you and then they actually put you on the dartboard, but also those same people had respected you enough that they had your back and they had told you when those drugs were planted in your office. Like
yeah.
there's obviously, you have the ability to make people feel comfortable and at ease, yet you obviously have earned an awful amount of respect from those same people as well.
Well, they often say, oh, you don't act like a minister. I said, thank you. And I said, I don't even have pajamas that have got a clerical collar on at night when I go to bed, And they kind of look at me. And my family my daughters and my son, they look at me and say, oh my God, Colville, grow up, I said, I will when I get older. But I mean, I don't know where the sense of humour came from, but it helps to break things down. The fact that I've got 20 years going to that service that could be so sad, but they give me a card it's a funny one, there's a minister in a car and the police stop him and said, and he says, have you been drinking? He says, no. And he says, I can actually smell it. And he says, oh my God, another miracle. The water's turned into wine, and they give me cards like that. And I think it's to do with the fact that we're in it together. And I've always thought that we don't need all this religiosity. And that's what I always thought with Jesus, all the important things about him was he said he thought about people who were in need and tried to help them. And he said the greatest thing in the world is love, and it's love we should strive for. And if we strive for those things, why do we need all the religiosity and all this loading on and all the rest? Someone said, how come you never made to being bishop? Yeah, well, the church put me out for 12 years, but there were still beautiful people in the church, and there is today, lovely people. But there's the others who are very judgmental of others. And I don't like that, because when you're judging someone, you don't see what they're capable of and what their strengths and what they can be. And once you do that, you can tap into that, and they often become very important people. Some of those have remained with me as friends for over all my life. And the person that helped me renew this building I'm in at the moment, which was falling down, it rocked in the wind because a tree was growing into it. The person that helped me most to build it was one of the rough kids from Colony. And I paid him, and then he was wasting most of his money down at the pub. So I stopped giving him all his money, and I saved it up until he was able to buy a block of land. And then he built his own little house on that. And that's what comes from somebody who'd been rejected by a community and been in and out of jail all the time. When he was in jail, we visited him. And that's how it works. But I'm no saint. Although when somebody said, were you upset when the church threw you out for 12 years? I was removed because, my ministry wasn't a normal ministry. I said, well, my initials are JC, Jim Colville, but they did a hell of a lot worse to the other JC. So what have I got to complain about? So people kind of say, oh, they don't know how to respond to that.
And that's the thing, because the thing that I love about hearing your stories, Jim, is that you're not your conventional minister of the church, and your view on religion and politics, and perhaps the politics of religion, are very different to how you seem to have lived your life, and and also how Margaret also lived her life as well, because she was very instrumental not only in Colony but also in her own life and her own advocacy work that she was doing.
That's right. She started a toy library with over 9,000 toys, and the toys were used and later on in some old age homes as well. And she did wonderful work in that area, and she became public guardian, acting public guardian at times for the state. Her degree was a podiatrist, and she had no other degree, but she was beautiful in the job because of what she was doing. And again, I suddenly realized when the people she was working with, how naive I'd become and so protected. She was working with people where their own families or even a neighbour had been picking up the check each, for a person who was on an aged care check, taking it to buy some food for them and all the rest, and then later on keeping it. And Margaret came in, and the persons were starving to death because they no money. And families were taking all the money from their mother and then putting her into a nursing home and then selling the house and all the furniture, and then realising that most of the check then was going to the home and then pulling her out again. Can you imagine how popular my wife was? And at times she had to go to some of these families and people with at least a sergeant of police. And on one occasion, she suddenly, when she was interviewing a guy who was ripping money off, he suddenly slammed the table against her in a community centre and jammed her against the door and then smashed her in the face and then damaged the car afterwards and it nearly killed her. She went into hospital with, blood pressure was over 200 and that. And that's what it was like. And that's because she was trying to be the guardian, the protector of the person being treated so badly. So we kind of supported each other in these things. And because it's Tasmania, people would know what your phone number was. And some of them were so angry, you'd get calls all night, every 30 minutes or so during the night. And, you had to take the phone off the hook, but you're always worried it could be one of your children that needed support or something.
And that
So
is something that's important about I remember my dad was a JP in a very small regional town in Victoria, and it is such an important role when you are in a small community, because you do have to, notarize those documents and do those particular roles. And it sometimes takes quite a personal toll, and obviously a physical toll. And when, that violence was acted out against Margaret, how have you remained? Has it been your faith that's kept you through all of this, Jim, and kept going?
It's been important because by faith, I believe in Jesus Christ. And of course, you cannot deny that there was a Jesus of history. That historically is known, even through the Romans and others. He was also called Christ, and that's where you move into the area of faith. Was he also Christ? And to me, it's important how we live our lives. So, and I wouldn't have gone through what I've gone through if it hadn't have been that I was linked in through the church and so on. But on the other hand, I had problems with the conservatism of the church, but there were still beautiful people there. And that was the pull. But the uniting church, which I'm in at the moment, is still not perfect by a long way. But women can have any role from top to bottom and have fulfilled every position. And I like that. The other thing is, only 3 or so years ago, we were given the right to take, if we wanted to, it was given to each minister, the right to take a wedding ceremony for gay people or others, or the initials. And in 1975, I took a service. I couldn't marry them, but I took a service for two gay women, Christian women, and brought the wrath of God came down on me from all directions, from the
I can
church,
imagine.
from the government, and from politicians and everyone. They were two beautiful women.
And was this while you were in Tasmania?
Oh yes,
So,
1975. Yeah.
so this would have been when it was a criminal act as well at
Oh
that
yes,
stage.
yes.
Yeah.
That took a long time. Women, not for women, but for males. And for me to do it then, I was accused of what everything would come down. Like when I wanted to actually distribute contraceptives because I was breaking the law. But it changed just in time. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been a JP. And anyway, 2 years ago, I took the wedding ceremony for my granddaughter, who is gay, to her beautiful partner. And I know how people, when they are rejected by their family and by others, they find it very hard to come out. And when they suddenly find that they're accepted, and I can remember my granddaughter coming along and saying, "Oh my God, my grandfather's an old clergyman." And then I brought the book out and showed her in 1975 where I'd taken the service. She's beautiful. And no, she was accepted. And again, this, why is it wrong? And now the church has allowed me that right to do that. After 75 to 2023, it took a few years, but we are the one church where we can do it. And that just, the joy of celebrating that with them, and it's legitimate and right. They love each other. So who are we to judge them? But, even being a JP, the other funny part about that, when I turned 85, originally they were going to cut us off at much younger than that. And we won the battle on the fact it was discrimination based on age, not on ability. Good fight. And when I turned 85, I couldn't be a JP anymore because they wouldn't go past 85. So the day before, I'd been doing some beautiful things that were quite complicated. And then on my birthday, by law, my brain turned to mush. And, so there's all these beautiful things happen. And sometimes you've got to fight for them. You're not always very popular because you're fighting for them. The other area I worked in was with the Aboriginal people. When I was at East Devonport, they were treated so badly. People didn't even want to be known that they had Aboriginal background. And I arranged to bring Chicka Dixon and Doug Nichols, who later on became the governor of South Australia, and at the moment, a beautiful person who was a pastor in the Church of Christ, brought him over. And that was a time where Truganini, her bones were on display up till 1948 in the museum. And I tried for ages, and this was much later, to try and get them to release them. And at one stage, a number of people said, "Let's organise them, we'll steal them. We want you to take a church service for over the bones, and then we'll knock them off and steal them." I thought, no, people will get hurt, and it wasn't Tasmanian Aboriginals involved. Later on, finally, 100 years later, the government changed the rules and her remains were cremated. And I was one of the few gubbers or white people that were invited to that at that time. And it still moves me to look down on her bones and see this lady who had seen her whole race almost destroyed and her husband killed and her raped. And I saw just these bones and thought, oh my God, what you went through. And I still am moved deeply by it. But in the end, Tasmanian Aboriginals and others gained the ashes and they were poured into the water on the way to Bruny Island, which was one of the areas where she was important in that area. So I've had a lot of things happening, but even being supportive of Aboriginals, that can bring a lot down on you too from people who are quite prejudiced against them. So I organised for over 100 young people to come over and we took them on tours in buses and they learnt about the history of the place. And the funny part was that the Victorian government, they mainly came from the mainland, the Victorian government cut the funding at the last minute because I wanted to have an Aboriginal leader. And they said, the leader you've chosen, we don't want an Aboriginal leader and we don't want the one you've chosen because he's had a hard life and been in jail a couple of times. So I went ahead without the money and it went ahead and we had Chicka Dixon there and he was absolutely superb as a leader. And he don't be like I was. And he said, I've been to 3 universities and then he named 3 jails. He was a beautiful person and they learnt so much. And again, it was a learning thing. And when somebody said, oh, this is where history started, Chicka said, no, white history started here. This is not where black history started. And one night somebody gave him a whole lot of fish and we're on the beach and he got bark and cooked the fish and all these Aboriginal people are sitting around with white people as well, white children, and just enjoying life and suddenly feeling we're actually acknowledged. We're not just rubbish to be pushed out of the way. And again, suddenly with the acceptance, they started to blossom. And that was because we had an Aboriginal leader and they said, we've never seen before an Aboriginal leader telling others that you're taking instructions from an Aboriginal. So, there's been some terrible time. My wife used to say, for God's sake, we just slow it down a bit, mate. A lot of battles.
Well, Jim, seeing we're going near all of the taboo and topics that have a lot of stigma around them, the one that you did mention briefly earlier, which is quite prevalent today and has always been, but still remains something that is quite taboo to discuss, and that is suicide, especially when it comes to a religious aspect associated with that as well. Can you talk me through how you've supported people who have contemplated taking their own life or have actually taken their own life, and how do you support those around them?
When somebody dies, it leaves the family or the people who are nearest to the person, it often leaves them with incredible guilt. What did I do wrong? What could I have done? Sometimes it's an immense surprise to them. I also find that many others, when they give a hint of what they're going to do, that hint is the chance to help them. It's when they finally decide they are going to do it and tell nobody, then you can't stop it. Then you're left with people who are just so full of looking at themselves and saying, what have we done wrong that this could happen in our family? And somebody we loved has done this. So it's a matter of supporting them in that situation. And again, for the one who's contemplating it, like the girls that used to often come and finish up, some of them and have to go off and have a backyard abortion, some died from it. You've got to find alternatives to that and an acceptance. So often acceptance I've found where people who all their life have been treated like I was, that you're useless and hopeless. You've got to say, let's start to go through what is important in your life and what you have achieved and the fact that people love you and all the rest, and you build it up. And suddenly, only about 5 years ago, somebody turned up at home and she walked in and said, you won't remember me, but here's a lunch for you. She said, 40 years ago, I was ready to commit suicide and I dropped into Colony and your wife and I and myself spoke to me and it changed my whole life. And since then, I've done a degree and all this other thing has happened. And 40 years later, she turns up with a meal for me. So that's the kind of change that can come. But it really hurts. And at times I feel exhausted. Jesus said in one point where somebody was a woman was in trouble and she touched his robe and he felt the power go out of him to her, And at times like that, you've got to allow yourself to be used and to try and help people, even if you're tired yourself. And then suddenly these kind of things happen. The rejection often, a person who came to me and 40 years later, they too, she was a Catholic and they wouldn't allow her to marry somebody from Asia and had been rejected and all the rest. And when I knew that they loved each other, she'd been totally rejected. I took the marriage ceremony 40 years later, happily married, and she writes to me and says, thank you for being the one person that would take the marriage for us. That marriage has been absolutely beautiful and has continued all that time. A total denial of all the people that are around criticizing other people and often cause people to commit suicide because they're always putting them down rather than lifting them up. So it's been a privilege. I feel humbled by, I learned from the people, their strength, their resilience, their ability to suffer so much and yet come back and say, oh, well, things could get better. That's why my family are going to play the music at my grave, when I die. I said, not before. Always look on the bright side. And everyone thought it was going to be a hymn. No, always look on the bright side. I mean, what else? And you're being crucified and you're singing always look on the bright side. If that isn't a commitment to possibility, what
It
is?
is hilarious. And for those of you who are not familiar, Always Look on the Bright Side is part of a skit with Monty Python and The Life of Brian. And I grew up watching that with my siblings, and that is hilarious.
That
I
is,
love
yeah.
that.
Well, that's the music they're playing when they roll me out, and
I love it. So,
yeah.
Jim, what does the next few years hold for you? Last year you were named the Senior Australian of the Year for Tasmania. What does your time look like? When are you going to, you appear to be retired, but I don't think that you're ever going to slow down. What do you do to take care of yourself? And what do you want to see your sort of twilight years involved?
Well, at 87, I'm talking about day by day, you see, and I think that's important. When you wake up and you're still here, one of the carers for my daughter who comes in, I rarely get a sleep in, but when I did, she came in and she thought, oh my goodness, Vicar, Vicar. I said, it's all right, I'm still alive. I'm off again for another day. It's the people, I think. The church calls us recycled ministers now.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, because we're still working, even though no, I think it's just beautiful people keep me going. And I'm trying to do my family tree, which I told my children it's turned into a nut tree. But the joke of all time is that when I came, I've been in Tasmania since 1967. They still said I wasn't a Tasmanian. But in studying it, I found out that my grandmother's grandmother had been born to a convict, and her mother was a convict in Hobart town. And I
Ah,
followed it up. So my family came through, and they left there and went to Melbourne, and that's my family. They left when they got the 14 years was up, and
so you have got some, Tasmanian roots there in the family tree.
through the convicts, yes, through the
Yeah.
convict side. And it's so sad because when I studied it, my great grandmother's, when she was born, her mother, who was the convict that came out, one day the children were crying and she lit a candle and it flicked back into her clothes and she caught fire and burnt, ran down the street in flames and took 3 days to die. And that street, when I drive up it now, I think of her and what she
Oh,
went through, and that my relative was only 3 or 4 when that happened to her mother. And that the mother had stolen 1 or 2 things for food and been I've found the original trial was to be put to death, and then they wanted more women in Tasmania, and she was given 14 years to bring over here. So when I look at that, I think, oh my goodness, what have I got to complain about anything? You know, that was part of my family background, and they moved over to Melbourne, and that's where I came from. So I just, when you read that and see what other people, when I see what other people go through, I'm just humbled by how fortunate I am, you know, and when I can concentrate on that, that's the importance. And some people have, if I could just read something to you that is very important, that the reality is that, I don't know who wrote this, the reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Nor should you be the same, nor would you want to be the same. And that's the kind of thing I'd read when I'm at that 20 year thing, that kind of thing. And the other one was, that's always meant a lot to me. When we lose somebody we love, we must learn not to live without them, but to live with the love they left behind.
Yeah,
That's how I feel about my wife.
that is so beautiful, Jim. I can't thank you enough for sharing and giving us some sort of insight to your amazing wife, Margaret, and the life that you've both lived together down there in Tasmania, and just how much you have supported the local community around that area and Davey Street with Colony 47. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I hope I don't regret it, all my sharing, especially the tattoo. But thank you for your
they'll
kindness.
know now, Jim.
Oh, well, I've still got I've got a year to take it back. No, thank you so much for your courtesy and your kindness. Thank you.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.